Hey everybody. So today I want to talk a little bit about house elf slavery and SPEW. And I'll preface this by saying that I'm going to try to avoid spoilers, and also there's a lot to pack into under 15 minutes, so for both of those reasons I'm definitely going to miss a lot of things. If you look at the resources in the folder for the WTF JK assignment, you'll see that there's a ton of people who've written about house elf slavery in this series. And part of the reason is that no one can quite decide what to make of it. Why is it there? Why do most people in the book seem unconcerned? What point is Rowling trying to make? And it's honestly not really clear. But let's start by talking about influences. So we know that Rowling is a magpie. She pulls from myth and folklore from around the world. So while we, as American readers, might immediately see parallels to slavery in the US, it's almost certain that Rowling was originally drawing on Scottish and French folklore. Scottish folklore, going back as far back as the 16th century, includes this protective household spirit called a brownie or broonie, who does chores at night in return for offerings of food. They're brown, hairy, ugly, and they're usually male, and they're said to ensure the prosperity of the house or the farm, though they also play tricks and make general mischief. In some stories, brownies are the ghosts of dead servants, but they're free to leave the house if they don't want to work there anymore, and if they do, they take the house's prosperity with them. One reason that brownies might choose to leave is if the family gives them clothes. Farfadets are a similar figure in French folklore. They're small, brown, wrinkly, and they wear ragged clothes. They similarly do farm or household chores in return for food, and they are scared off or offended if people offer them new clothes. There are similar household spirits in a lot of folklore, but these two stand out as likely sources for the house elves in Harry Potter. Importantly, though, in neither of these traditions are the creatures enslaved. They're also not magically forced to abuse themselves if they disobey the wishes or orders of the people in the house, which is a particularly messed up element of the house elf slavery. So why add these elements? What is Rowling doing here? In explicitly enslaving the house slaves, she does seem to be drawing on our real-world histories of slavery. And that could be valuable. It could be a means of using metaphor to bring young readers into these important conversations about the history of white people in the US and Europe, kidnapping, enslaving, and terrorizing Black people. Unfortunately, that's not what she does. Instead, she starts by giving the house elves speech patterns that mimic the way the Black slave characters spoke in early 20th century Hollywood films by white screenwriters. This is, at a minimum, extremely cringy, and not helped by the fact that each elf has a different version of non-standard English, so that it's not even plausibly a dialect. One scholar, Bryson Carey, argues that 1930s and 1940s Hollywood films were one of the few representations of African Americans to reach British audiences until the late 20th century, so Rowling may have grown up with these movies and passively absorbed these stereotypes. Still, Rowling, no! What have we said about failing to critically examine the things that we passively absorb as children? But arguably worse than these sort of Gone with the Wind era stereotypes and tropes that Rowling uses to portray the house elves are the narratives and myths that her metaphor seems to encourage. These books literally put the talking points of 18th and 19th century enslavers in the mouths of some of our most beloved characters, and then ultimately fail to adequately rebut them, either in dialogue or in the plot. So when Hermione sort of wakes up in this book and moves from passive curiosity about Harry's elf friend Dobby, to outrage at house elf slavery, she meets resistance from basically every other character she talks to. I guess Harry kind of shrugs, but the twins, Ron, Nearly Headless Nick, even Hagrid all argue with her. And they tell her in various ways that this is the natural state of things. Hagrid literally says it's in their nature to look after humans. And I'm sure I don't need to explain why claiming that a race of humans or humanoid beings has a biological predisposition towards servitude is a problem, but I'll just add that this has historic roots. When Hermione responds by pointing out that Dobby doesn't seem to be part of this essentialized monolith of natural slaves, Hagrid pulls a no true Scotsman move and tells her, oh, well, Dobby's just a weirdo. By and large, house elves don't want to be free. Furthermore, everyone tells Hermione house elves are happy being slaves. Ron says, quote, they like it. They like being enslaved, end quote. Talking about the Hogwarts elves, George says, they think they've got the best job in the world. Which brings us to not only a bit of historical pro-slavery propaganda, the slaves are happy, but also a modern genre trope, specifically the happy slaves of fantasy and science fiction. And Bayana Davis from the Wizard Team podcast has a great article on this, which I'm going to put in the description. But basically, happy slaves show up a lot in fantasy and science fiction. And one reason for this is simply that these genres tend to introduce a lot of non-human creatures and species that don't neatly fit into our classifications in the real world. So most people are not okay with human slavery, but pretty okay with humans owning, buying, and selling horses, and using them for work in exchange for food. But on the spectrum between humans and horses exist a lot of imaginary creatures in science fiction and fantasy, and how comfortable we are with their situation and how likely we are to call it slavery or to assume that they're either happy or unhappy depends a lot on how much we see the creatures as human. In making a direct link to enslaved people in the US through these really crude early Hollywood stereotypes, I very much hope that Rowling's purpose is to make the humanity of house elves really unambiguous. But clearly, the in-world characters don't see it that way. Ron specifically says, but they're not human. The other reason we see the happy slave trope in science fiction and fantasy is because those genres have historically been dominated by white writers. Not exclusively. My colleague, Deb Noel, teaches a course on African-American sci-fi that features 20th century writers like Octavia Butler and Samuel Delany. And certainly now we've got writers like N.K. Jemisin, who's the only author to win the Hugo Award for 3 years in a row. But white authors are very much overrepresented in fantasy and sci-fi. And while Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower books, for example, depict slavery with this combination of speculative fiction and horrific realism, white writers have tended to depict slavery through metaphor and with a lot of happy slaves. So, does Harry Potter fit this trope? At a minimum, it provides a mouthpiece for it in the repeated assertions from our, quote, good characters. Are they right? Are the house elves happy? I think that's less clear. For one thing, as always, we have Harry as our narrative guide, and he notices very little that doesn't directly affect him. But also, Rowling's written a version of slavery in which house elves must hurt themselves if they disobey orders, so there can be no idea of really meaningful consent. But based on what we see and hear from other characters, including some of the house elves in this and later books, I think it's possible that house elves are happy, which is troubling. Or at least I don't think we can definitively say the house elves are not happy. To say it more carefully, the house elves are not happy when their masters mistreat them, like the Malfoys who beat Dobby, or Barty Crouch when he yells at and humiliates Winky. But they're happy when they have, quote, good masters, like Dumbledore at Hogwarts, and later Harry, when he follows Dumbledore's advice about being nicer to Kreacher. And that's both deeply problematic and, again, historically rooted. This time in the ongoing discourse that says that the problem with slavery isn't and wasn't slavery itself, but the, quote, bad masters, which we see everywhere from talking heads on TV who are opposing the removal of Confederate statues to school textbooks, such as Texas United States History, published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, which contains lines like, quote, some slaves reported that their masters treated them kindly, end quote. As Bayana Davis concludes in her article, white fantasy and science fiction writers' fascination with writing about happy slaves with benevolent masters is a part of this larger project of sugarcoating history to assuage white people's guilt. So I encourage you to look out for that as we continue reading this series. But on the topic of white people, or metaphoric white people at least, let's talk about Hermione and SPEW. I will preface this by saying that I know a lot of us love Hermione and appreciate that she's at least trying to do something. Also, she's 14 and has basically zero models of activism or allyship in the magical world. Probably the closest thing she has is Arthur Weasley, who loves muggles but doesn't know any, and takes a paternalistic, condescending approach to crusading for muggle rights. Does that sound a little bit familiar? Since Hermione is at Hogwarts through the mid to late 1990s, she's also missing what's happening in the Muggle world in terms of activism, including the rise of the excellent phrase, nothing about us without us, among disability rights activists, which captures an important element of allyship that she's missed altogether. So Hermione announces to Harry and Ron, our short-term aims are to secure house elves fair wages and working conditions. And of course this is funny in the moment because she's the only member of SPEW, so our just means Hermione. But more to the point, our doesn't include any actual house elves. Hermione goes on to say, our long-term aims include changing the law about non-wand usage and trying to get an elf into the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures because they're shockingly underrepresented. Where else are house elves shockingly underrepresented? On the committee that's drafting this manifesto. When George tries to persuade Hermione that the Hogwarts elves are happy, he also asks her an important question. Has she ever been down to the kitchens? To put it more bluntly, has she ever met a house elf? Answer, once, very briefly. Has she ever asked any house elves what they want? No. Hermione is the mission tripper who's going to swoop in and solve the problems of a community that she's not a part of and hasn't consulted. Hermione is the straight person who's grabbing the megaphone and leading the queer rights march. She's the embodiment of the white savior trope. Later, we're going to see her try to trick the Hogwarts house elves into freedom because Hermione believes she knows what's best for them better than they do. They're brainwashed and uneducated, she says, and the implication is that it's not worth even asking them. And on some level, it's understandable. Hermione is horrified to discover that the food she's been eating is prepared by slave labor. And after a brief hunger strike, she's realized that she has to eat. She's complicit in a system that oppresses house elves. So Hermione's action, her solution, is about not wanting to be part of that system, which is commendable, but crucially far more about Hermione and what she wants than it is about house elves and what they want. And I want to acknowledge that I'm walking a fine line here. I'm not trying to side with the voices claiming that the slaves are happy, but I think the kind of allyship that Hermione shows us is one that requires further examination. We're all complicit in systems of oppression, and how we react to that realization matters. Whether we choose to make it about us or choose to listen to and center the voices of the people most effective, that also matters. So I guess my final question is what we're supposed to make of SPEW. Sorry, SPEW. The text mostly ridicules Hermione for her campaign. Even the name that she chose is ridiculous. So I think we're meant to laugh at SPEW. SPEW. But I can't tell in what spirit is. The most generous reading, the one that I've eventually reached, is that Rowling is inviting us to critically examine our own allyship and activism. But that takes a fair amount of drilling down into the text, and I imagine your average young reader doesn't get there. So what does your average reader take away from this depiction of SPEW and the depiction of house elf slavery in the text in general? And how do those takeaways fit with the larger themes and messages of this series? So I want to think about that. I await your thoughts.